You know that feeling in the air right before a thunderstorm? When it's still sunny, still warm, heavy with humidity, and you can tell. The air feels thick, charged, like the sky could split open at any moment, unleashing a deluge that leaves everyone soaked. That's the kind of day it was when 21-year-old Dick Rowland rolled out of bed on the morning of May 30th, 1921. He got dressed and headed down to work. He went downtown to shine shoes outside the courthouse. Just another day. He couldn't have known that by nightfall his name would be etched into history. Not because of anything he did, but because the storm had already decided that it needed a spark. Before 1921, Greenwood was doing something that America said black people couldn't. It wasn't surviving or scraping by. It was thriving. Before it became known as Black Wall Street, Greenwood was a community of black-owned businesses, black professionals, and black property owners, all operating inside a system designed to exclude them. Doctors treated black patients, lawyers represented black clients, teachers educated black children. There were grocery stores, hotels, theaters, newspapers, and banks. Money moved block to block, family to family, often circulating several times before ever leaving the district. This wasn't a slum, it was an ecosystem. That prosperity didn't happen by accident. To understand Greenwood, you have to go back to what came before it. After the Civil War, the United States entered a period called Reconstruction, a brief moment when the federal government tried to rebuild the South and protect the rights of newly freed black Americans. For a time, black men voted. They held office. They built businesses. But when Reconstruction collapsed in the late 1870s, those protections were withdrawn. And what replaced them was a set of laws called Jim Crow. A system of segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence enforced by mobs and the law. After Reconstruction collapsed, life in the American South became increasingly dangerous for black families. Jim Crow laws, racial terror, and economic suppression make progress nearly impossible. So many black Americans didn't just flee the South, they relocated with intent. Oklahoma, still forming out of Indian territory, looked like an opening. Land was available. Black towns were being founded. Self-governance felt possible. This wasn't hope, it was strategy. Greenwood also grew out of a broader tradition of black town building in Oklahoma. Communities built around ownership, cooperation, and internal economies. But Greenwood had something different. It had a planner. O.W. Gurley, a black landowner and entrepreneur, purchased land just north of the railroad tracks in Tulsa and made a deliberate choice. He sold property only to black buyers. That decision mattered. It meant ownership was widespread. Businesses were rooted. Wealth stayed inside the community. This wasn't segregation imposed from the outside, but insulation built from the inside. Ironically, Jim Crow accelerated Greenwood's growth because black residents were barred from Tulsa's businesses. They were forced to rely on their own. Black professionals served black customers. Black money stayed black longer. Segregation tried to starve Greenwood. Instead, it concentrated it. Greenwood also sat next to a booming oil city. Tulsa's wealth came from oil, but black residents were largely excluded from ownership and executive power. Still, Greenwood benefited indirectly. Housing, food, tailoring, transportation, entertainment. Greenwood didn't own the oil. It served the city built on it. Most importantly, Greenwood invested in institutions before excess. Schools, churches, newspapers, fraternal organizations. That infrastructure produced literacy, professional networks, and civic awareness. Greenwood didn't just build businesses, it built stability. And all of this happened during a very narrow historical window. After slavery, before redlining, before mass incarceration, before federal retreat from civil rights. For a brief moment, black prosperity was visible, and visibility has consequences. Because Greenwood didn't just grow wealthy, it challenged an idea America was built on, that black success had limits. What happened next wasn't spontaneous. It was a reaction. By mid-morning, Dick Rowland was already on his way downtown to the courthouse. The same routine as always. He was 21, a shoe shiner, trying to get through the day like anyone else. There was no way he could have known that in a few hours, just walking to work, would place his name at the center of one of the darkest chapters in American history. That morning, Dick Rowland arrived at the downtown Drexel building where he worked shining shoes near the courthouse. At the same time, another ordinary workday was beginning, for someone who didn't yet know history was about to learn her name. The elevator was operated by Sarah Page, who was 17 at the time. Her name would later be attached to an event she never publicly described. By the next morning, the story was no longer confined to an elevator. It appeared in print. A local afternoon ran a sensational headline. The facts were thin. The language was not. Within hours, rumor traveled faster than truth ever could. By the afternoon of May 31st, the story had spread beyond the newspaper. Rumors multiplied. Each retelling added detail. Each detail added certainty. By evening, a white crowd gathered outside the courthouse. They came not to ask questions, but expecting answers. Word reached Greenwood that a mob was forming. A group of black veterans, men who had worn the uniform of the United States, decided they would go downtown. Not to start trouble, but to make sure Dick Rowland would still be alive in the morning. The veterans arrived at the courthouse armed, not as a threat, but as a warning. They offered to help the sheriff protect Dick Rowland. The offer was refused. The crowd grew louder. Someone demanded the prisoner. The veterans turned to leave. As they did, the moment collapsed. Words were exchanged. A weapon was reached for. A single shot was fired. That shot didn't start the violence. It revealed how much violence was already waiting. The sound echoed through downtown Tulsa, and the night broke open. What followed was not chaos. It was direction. White men were deputized on the spot. Badges were handed out. Weapons were distributed. The line between mob and law disappeared. By midnight, the violence had a destination. Greenwood. Cars moved north. Gunfire followed. Homes were marked. Businesses were targeted. This was not a riot that spread at random. It moved with purpose. Just after midnight, Greenwood was still asleep. Families were in their homes. Children were in their beds. There was no warning. Gunfire came first, then fire. Homes were broken into. Businesses were looted. Buildings were set ablaze, sometimes with people still inside. Greenwood did not burn all at once. It burned block by block, street by street. Some residents fought back where they could. Others fled north, toward open land. Many ran with nothing but the clothes they were wearing. By morning, smoke hung over Tulsa. Entire neighborhoods were gone. As the night gave way to morning, the violence did not stop. It escalated. Airplanes circled overhead. Some were used to scout Greenwood. Others dropped incendiaries. Bottles, fire, explosives, onto buildings below. This wasn't rumor. It was witnessed. It was reported. It was ignored. On the ground, another pattern took hold. Black residents were rounded up at gunpoint. Not the attackers, the survivors. Thousands were marched into detention centers. The fairgrounds, the convention hall, other holding areas across the city. They were told they could leave only if a white employer vouched for them. Greenwood was burning, and its people were being imprisoned. By the time the fires burned out, Greenwood lay in ruins. More than 35 square blocks were destroyed. Homes, businesses, churches, schools. An estimated 1,200 homes were burned. Nearly all of Greenwood was wiped out in less than 24 hours. The official death count was set at 39. Historians now believe the true number was far higher, likely in the hundreds. Many deaths were never recorded. Bodies were buried without documentation. Some were dumped into unmarked graves. No one was convicted for the destruction of Greenwood. No one was held accountable for the killings. Insurance claims were denied. Reconstruction was blocked. Greenwood's residents were released from detention not with justice, but with nothing. Greenwood's story did not end in ashes. When the fires burned out and the troops withdrew, residents returned. They came back to rubble, to foundations without buildings, to streets where entire blocks had vanished. Many had lost everything they owned, and still they stayed. They built homes out of tents and scrap wood. Churches reopened in basements and temporary shelters. Businesses operated out of whatever space could be found. Greenwood rebuilt without insurance money, without compensation, without justice. Within a few years, hundreds of homes and businesses stood again. Not because help arrived, but because leaving was not an option. And then, something else happened. Tulsa stopped talking about it. The massacre disappeared from newspapers, from classrooms, from official histories. Survivors were discouraged from speaking. Some were threatened. Others learned that silence was safer. For decades, the destruction of Greenwood went unmentioned in Oklahoma schools. In some cases, it was denied outright. A city was erased once by fire, and again by forgetting. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Tulsa began to publicly acknowledge what had happened. Investigations were launched. Mass graves were searched for. Survivors told their stories, many for the first time. But acknowledgement did not come with repair. No broad restitution, no criminal accountability, no restoration of what was taken. Greenwood was remembered, but never made whole. The Tulsa Race Massacre wasn't a riot. It was a coordinated destruction of a community that had dared to thrive. It happened because of a lie. It spread because of language. And it was allowed because power chose not to intervene. Greenwood proved something America said was impossible. And for that, it was punished. Remembering Greenwood isn't about the past. It's about recognizing how fragile process can be, and how quickly a storm can return when the conditions are right. If you're still here, thanks. I've got stories that the history books left out. Drop a like. Hit subscribe. Welcome to the Underground Syllabus.